Hello, everyone. I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking to you about some materials that you're seeing in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 that may be a little confusing. So I want to spend a little time talking about some graphs and charts you'll see in Chapters 2 and 3, excuse me. In Chapter 2, they start out wanting to discuss the production possibility frontier and also the circular flow of income. If we look at the circular flow of income, we can see the movement of money or spending from the households that becomes revenue to the firms. But what we have to understand is that money does not stop moving. It's a continual cycle in exchange for the factors of production, which are land, labor, and capital. The market to the firms from the south side of the bottom side of this chart is for the factors of production. The top is for goods and services. If we go back and discuss households, they can exist without firms. We can see it in some of the tribal regions in Africa and in South America. There's tribes that don't have a Walmart or a Walgreens or a Dollar General, and they survive. But what you will see is a lower life expectancy, growth patterns, high infant mortality, etc. Because whether we like it or not, firms do make our life a little bit easier. But there has to be an exchange of goods and factors of production. We work for the firms. We supply them land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship so they can produce the goods and services in the free market. But that's the first model that they wanted to talk to you about. The second one is the production possibility frontier. And what it does is it gives us the ability to determine how to best utilize our factors of production, our land, labor, and capital. In this case, they have two products. They have the computers and they have cars produced. If we were only to make computers in this marketplace, we could produce 3,000. If we were only to produce cars, we could produce 1,000. So we could say that there was a pretty strong opportunity cost between the two. They can build 3 computers to every 1 car, etc. But with the nonlinear curve, it's not going to be a perfect offset. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the points in the production possibility frontier. At all of these points, we can produce the given amount of cars and computers, any combination along this curve. If we go outside the curve, or let's go inside first, we can produce anywhere in this shaded area, including the blue line, and be efficient at producing our goods and services. And we have the factors of production to deliver them. To be truly efficient, you have to be producing on this line. Anything inside is actually inefficient. They give us a point out here, C. And at the point C, it's unattainable. We do not have the factors of production to produce at that level. We don't know if it's land, which are gifts of nature. We don't know if it's labor, which is all human input, or capital, which is plant and equipment. We just know it cannot be done. Let's go to the final one, and it gives you a long explanation of the production possibility frontier. I will tell you that once we move over to Chapter 3, you can see we can actually go outside of the production possibility curve through something called trade. Now let's move over to the parable of the modern economy. what they're looking at are two firms. You got one firm that's run by Ruby the rancher, excuse me, and Frank the farmer. The parable goes through what they are capable of doing. Frank the farmer can produce 60 minutes. At 60 minutes an ounce is what it takes him to produce meat. He can produce potatoes at 15 minutes per ounce, or for 4 for an hour. Ruby is actually more efficient, and she has an absolute advantage because she can produce an ounce every 20 minutes on the meat and an ounce every 10 minutes on the potatoes. But let's get these to an 8-hour shift. Based on the information we have here, Frank the farmer can produce 1 ounce per minute. In an 8-hour shift, that would be 8 ounces. Frank the farmer can produce 4 potatoes per hour, and 4 times 8 would be 32. Ruby can produce an ounce every 20 minutes of the meat and an ounce every 10 minutes for the potatoes. So that would, over an 8-hour period, that'd be 24 ounces of meat and 48 ounces of potatoes. If we look at these two production possibility curves, this is Frank's production possibility curve. It shows on the meat axis, or the y-axis, it shows if Frank only produces meat, he can produce 8 ounces. On the other hand, if Frank decides to only produce potatoes, he can produce 32. And we see the same references over here for Ruby the rancher, except the numbers are a little different. The axes are the same. In an 8-hour period, Ruby can produce 24 ounces of meat or 48 ounces of potatoes. This shows the consumption or desired consumption for both Ruby and Frank. Right here. Frank will consume 4 ounces of meat and 16 ounces of potatoes. Ruby will consume 12 ounces of meat and 24 ounces of potatoes, excuse me. If we look over time, let me go back one more. That graph is based on no trade. There's no interaction between the two parties. But what we want to know is which one has an absolute advantage on meat and potatoes. If we look at the numbers, Ruby the rancher has an absolute advantage on both products. But you see the gap between them is not as great on potatoes as it is on meat. So apparently Ruby is a much better rancher than Frank, and Frank is a better potato maker or grower. So let's assume that, let's let Frank specialize in potatoes. And he can grow 32 ounces of potatoes. If we establish trade, we can see what happens between the two parties. With specialization, Frank will produce 32. Let's take it one step at a time. We can see what each one can produce. With trade, Frank's going to produce 32 ounces of potatoes. Rose, excuse me, they changed names in the middle of it, 18 ounces of meat and 12 ounces of potatoes. They agreed to trade 5 ounces of meat for 15 ounces of potatoes. So when we look at the graph, Frank's producing at 32 and Rose is producing at 18 and 12. In the agreement, Rose agrees to give 5 ounces to Frank, and in return receives 15 ounces of potatoes. If we look at where everybody stands after a trade, if Frank gives up 15 ounces of potatoes, you will have 17 remaining, which is more than the original consumption. If Frank receives the 5 ounces of meat, you'll now have 1 ounce of meat greater than what he had before. And it's actually at a level that exceeds the production possibility curve. So they were both better off. And we can see that when we move over to Rose's. She produced 18, gave away 5, that leaves 13. The original consumption was 12. And the point will be right here, because Rose produced 12 ounces of potatoes and then received 15 additional ounces from Frank, and now the production level is right here at 727. So Frank gained 1 ounce of potatoes and 1 ounce of meat, while Rose gained 1 ounce of meat and 3 ounces of potatoes. They are both better off now than they were before, and it's simply because of trade. You can see the increase in consumption for each party. That's what I just discussed a moment ago. Now let's look at the comparative advantage. We know at the beginning Rose had an absolute advantage on both products, meat and potatoes. But we're going to look at opportunity costs. We talked about absolute. The opportunity costs, I have a little video here. Every one of you can see it. There's a lot of materials that are available to you on this topic. It doesn't appear that one's
opportunity cost, right?
No.
One way to define opportunity cost is it is the value of what certain resources could have produced had they been used in the best alternative way. All right, well, let's think about that. First off, the idea of cost. Don't get hung.
Okay. I've seen it before. So I'm going to head on down to this table, table number 1. This is the opportunity cost of meat and potatoes based on our previous graph. Frank the farmer can produce 4 potatoes for every ounce of meat. And he can produce 1 ounce of meat, 1/4 ounce of meat for every potato. So if he produces a potato, he gives up 1/4 ounce of meat. If he produces meat, he gives up 4 potatoes. Ruby the rancher, it only takes 2 ounces of potatoes to acquire 1 ounce of meat, but it takes 1/2 ounce of meat for 1 potato. So if we look at the comparative advantage, Ruby has a comparative advantage because her costs are much lower for the production of 1 ounce of meat than it is for Frank. 2 is less than 4. But let's go to the other column. In exchange for 1 ounce of potatoes, Ruby, well, there's Ruby, I don't know where Rose came from, but Ruby gives up a half an ounce of meat in exchange for an ounce of potatoes, and Frank gives up only a quarter of an ounce of meat. So Frank can specialize in production of potatoes, and both parties will be better off. That's the reason in the trade, Ruby was willing to produce all the meat as long as Frank produced all the potatoes, because he had a comparative advantage and his opportunity costs were much lower. Later in the chapter, they bring up the thought of trade and the application of comparative advantage, and in discussing the lawn mowing services for Serena Williams. I had to look for a second. Would it be more advantageous for her to cut her grass and spend an hour or 2 hours on it, or go to produce a commercial for $30,000? I would say her time is better spent producing or creating this commercial. Now, Forrest Gump can either cut the grass or make $50 at McDonald's. So I think it'd be better for Forrest Gump to cut the grass and let Serena go to work producing videos. Sometimes it's just a little common sense that you have to use to figure these things out. And that's part of thinking like an economist, except you use positive data, which means the numbers are actually given. In this case, I think they are given. We got a dishwasher. Somehow I missed it. I'll go back. We have positive data because this is given, it's known, it's not normative, which is just an assumption of what will happen. I can look at my phone and it can tell me exactly what the temperature is outside. That is positive data. But if I look at the last 3 days temperatures and I make an assumption that tomorrow will be warmer, that's normative. And you'll see those terms used a lot. But here's the discussion: should Serena Williams mow her own lawn? And the answer would be no. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at any time. Well, no, I did have a student contact me at 4:30 during the summer semester in the middle of the night, 4:30 a.m. Please don't do that. I respond to emails as quickly as I can get back to them, usually within a day or two, except on weekends. And we're going to have a long weekend. But if you have questions, feel free to ask. You can send me a text. Please include your name and your class and section so I know where to find you when I look it up. And I will either return your call, or if I can answer it with a quick text, I'll do that as well. But I will be checking my emails this weekend, but not as regularly as I would if I was in the office. So make sure you get your homework done. And I will see you and talk to you again next week. Have a good Labor Day.